August 19, 1943, an unnamed ridge in the central Solomon Islands. 800 United States Marines faced a military situation that every textbook said should end in annihilation. Major Frank Patterson received intelligence reports confirming that 2,500 Japanese troops were moving through dense jungle to encircle his position on elevated terrain overlooking a critical airfield. The doctrine was universal across all military academies. When facing a 3-1 numerical disadvantage with encirclement closing in, you execute a fighting withdrawal. You seek higher ground. You request immediate reinforcements. You retreat. Patterson studied the faces of his exhausted men. Their ammunition stores were depleted. Their escape routes were cut off. The jungle behind them offered no sanctuary. He made a choice that violated everything written in strategic manuals. He ordered his forces to compress their perimeter even tighter. He commanded them to allow the enemy to surround them completely, to let them believe they had won before the battle even began. In the suffocating darkness of the Pacific jungle, Japanese columns closed in from multiple angles, confident they were about to execute a devastating encirclement. What unfolded would rewrite defensive warfare doctrine and transform certain death into one of the most lopsided victories the Marine Corps had ever witnessed. The jungle humidity clung to everything as night consumed the ridge on August 20th. Major Frank Patterson moved through his defensive positions with the measured pace of a commander who had already made peace with the mathematics of warfare. 800 Marines, 2,500 confirmed Japanese troops advancing through the jungle. The numbers told only part of the story. The ridge itself was unremarkable. A modest volcanic spine rising perhaps 50 feet above the surrounding terrain, stretching roughly a mile in length. Military strategists back in Pearl Harbor would have classified it as insignificant. To the Marines digging into its slopes, it represented the only barrier between American control of the nearby airfield and complete catastrophe in the Pacific. Patterson had deployed his forces with the precision of a chess grandmaster playing for survival. His first assault company occupied the northern sector closest to the airfield, while his second company held the southern approaches. Between them, they commanded overlapping fields of fire that covered every possible route through the jungle. But Patterson understood something crucial. Firepower alone would not save them. The Japanese had demonstrated repeatedly that they would march directly into devastating casualties to achieve their objectives. General Tomiyasu Matsuda commanded 3 times their manpower, moving through the darkness, and his reputation suggested he would use every soldier he had. The Marines had endured weeks of combat on this island. The jungle had become their enemy almost as much as the Japanese. The heat turned every metal surface into a furnace by day and slick with moisture at night. Canvas deteriorated within weeks. Food spoiled within days. Men lost weight they could not afford to lose and developed illnesses that drained their strength. But they had also learned to interpret the jungle's sounds. They could detect enemy movement through dense undergrowth by listening to the disturbance it created. As Patterson inspected his positions, he found Sergeant Marcus Webb adjusting the ammunition feed on his water-cooled Browning machine gun. The weapon was a relic from the previous World War, heavy and cumbersome at 41 pounds without its support tripod. But it sustained a rate of fire that could eliminate human targets at ranges exceeding 500 yards. Webb had proven himself in prior engagements, displaying the kind of steady performance under fire that distinguished combat veterans from freshly arrived replacements. "How's your ammunition holding up, Sergeant?" Patterson asked, crouching beside the gun position. "Enough to convince them this hill isn't worth climbing, sir. Though another belt or two wouldn't hurt if things get serious." Nearby, Lance Corporal James Mitchell was positioned in his fighting hole with his rifle loaded and bayonet attached. The young Marine had arrived only 4 weeks earlier, still bearing the appearance of someone fresh from training. The jungle had already begun transforming him. His uniform hung loose on his frame, and his eyes carried the particular watchfulness that came from knowing death could arrive from any direction without warning. The Japanese plan, according to intelligence reports and documents captured from previous patrols, centered on speed and psychological shock. Matsuda's forces had been moving through jungle trails for 4 days, following pathways that only experienced guides could navigate. Their assault was designed to come from 3 sides simultaneously, overwhelming the American position through sheer numbers and the terror of fighting in complete darkness. What Matsuda had not anticipated was the defensive preparation Patterson had implemented over the previous 10 days. Every approach to the ridge had been studied, measured, and registered for mortar and artillery fire. Marines had cleared vegetation to create fields of fire extending 300 yards in all directions. Limited wire obstacles had been positioned to channel attacking forces into the most effective engagement zones. Patterson's Marines also possessed advantages that would never appear in intelligence documents. Their training emphasized individual decision-making and tactical adaptation, qualities that proved invaluable when larger unit formations collapsed under fire. Unlike Japanese soldiers who depended on rigid group tactics, American Marines could fight effectively as individuals when battalion-level organization broke down. They could identify targets, make firing decisions, and coordinate with nearby Marines without waiting for orders from higher command. As darkness deepened, the jungle's voice changed. The constant chorus of insects and nocturnal animals gradually faded into an unnatural silence that every XPERNCED Marine recognized as a warning. Thousands of Japanese soldiers were moving into position somewhere in the darkness below, and even the wildlife sensed their approach. Patterson made a final inspection of the defensive positions, speaking quietly with squad leaders and checking ammunition supplies. The Marines carried roughly 200 rounds per rifleman, supplemented by grenades, mortars, and machine guns that would anchor their defense. It was not abundant, but it was enough for men who had learned to make every round count. Radio reports crackled from observation posts scattered throughout the jungle perimeter. Japanese forces had been spotted approaching along 3 separate routes, confirming the expected multi-directional assault. Enemy soldiers were close enough now that their voices occasionally carried through the undergrowth. Speaking in the sharp tones of military commands, at 11:30 p.m., mortar rounds began falling on the ridge. The explosions were scattered and imprecise, indicating that Matsuda's forces were still moving into position and attempting to calibrate their indirect fire weapons. The bombardment served its psychological purpose, regardless of accuracy. It announced to the Marines that the expected attack was finally arriving. Patterson took his position at the command post, a shallow sandbag depression at the ridge's highest point. From this vantage, he could observe his entire defensive line and maintain radio contact with the nearby airfield. The airfield's artillery batteries were standing by, their guns already loaded and aimed at predetermined firing zones. The jungle erupted into chaos as the first Japanese infantry wave emerged from the tree line, their voices raised in the traditional battle cry that had terrified Allied forces across the Pacific. But as they charged up the ridge's slopes, they encountered something General Matsuda had not accounted for in his battle plan. The Marines did not break, they did not retreat. Instead, they opened fire with disciplined precision that transformed the hillside into a zone of death. Webb's machine gun opened fire at 800 yards. The heavy rounds from the Browning cut through the charging Japanese like a scythe cutting through grain. The water-cooled barrel allowed sustained fire that bolt-action rifles simply could not match. Webb had positioned his gun to rake the primary approach route. Each burst of 5 to 7 rounds left the barrel in less than 2 seconds, and at this distance, nearly every round found its mark and ended a life. The Japanese assault had been planned according to traditional infantry doctrine that valued speed and shock over firepower. Matsuda expected his forces to close the distance quickly, using darkness and numerical superiority to overcome the Americans. But the ridge's geography worked against them in ways that no reconnaissance could have revealed. The Marines had spent weeks studying every approach, every depression in the ground, every piece of cover that attacking soldiers might use. Lance Corporal Mitchell sighted down his rifle barrel and squeezed the trigger. A Japanese soldier, 30 yards downslope from his position, stumbled and collapsed. The young Marine worked the bolt action with mechanical precision, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a fresh round. Around him, the distinctive crack of American rifles created a steady rhythm underneath the deeper roar of the machine guns. The fundamental error in Matsuda's thinking was misunderstanding American defensive doctrine. Japanese military strategy emphasized the spiritual superiority of the attack, the belief that determined soldiers could overcome any obstacle through force of will and courage. American doctrine focused on maximizing firepower and creating overlapping zones of fire that would annihilate attacking forces before they could reach effective range. Patterson's Marines had converted the ridge into a fortress designed to exploit every advantage modern weapons could provide. Japanese forces advancing from the south encountered their first catastrophic surprise when mortar rounds began detonating among their ranks. The Marines had pre-calculated every likely avenue of approach, measuring distances during daylight hours when they could work unobserved. Now, in darkness, those calculations delivered precision. High explosive shells detonated with lethal accuracy among densely packed Japanese infantry. Corporal Ishiro Tanaka led his squad through undergrowth, desperately seeking cover as American bullets whistled overhead and mortar fragments cut through the jungle canopy. The veteran non-commissioned officer had participated in successful night attacks across the Pacific. This was different. The American fire was too accurate, too sustained, too well-coordinated to be panicked defenders shooting wildly into darkness. These Marines were firing with purpose. Japanese soldiers were dying faster than they could advance. The tactical reality that Matsuda was only beginning to understand became obvious as his second assault wave emerged from the jungle. To find the ground ahead littered with the bodies of their comrades, the Marines had not merely stopped the first attack, they had done so with such devastating efficiency that attacking forces were already losing organization. Japanese squad leaders and platoon sergeants, the experienced, non-commissioned officers who held units together in combat, were being systematically eliminated by American marksmen, who had learned to identify targets of opportunity in muzzle flashes and movement patterns. Every experienced leader lost meant another Japanese squad fighting without direction. Patterson monitored the battle from his command post, receiving reports from subordinate commanders and calling in artillery support from the airfield. The colonel understood this was not a probing attack. Matsuda had committed significant forces, and the enemy's persistence indicated they viewed the ridge as critically important. But Patterson also recognized that the Japanese were making fundamental tactical errors his Marines were trained to exploit. The airfield's artillery batteries had been registered on predetermined zones around the ridge. Now those guns began speaking with devastating effect. The 155mm howitzers delivered high explosive shells with precision, guided by forward observers maintaining communication with gun crews. Each shell created a lethal radius of fragmentation across 40 yards, and the guns were firing at a rate of 4 rounds per minute. Japanese tactics relied on infiltration and close assault. But the ridge's terrain offered limited concealment for large formations. The Marines had cleared zones of fire extending 300 yards in every direction, creating killing fields where attacking forces would be exposed to concentrated fire from multiple positions. Even in darkness, muzzle flashes from Japanese weapons revealed their positions to American gunners trained to engage targets by sound and visual signature. As the third assault wave formed, Patterson implemented tactics that would become standard doctrine for American forces throughout the Pacific War. Rather than simply holding static positions, Marine squads began executing limited counterattacks designed to disrupt Japanese formations before they could organize coordinated assaults. These small lunette actions, led by experienced, non-commissioned officers like Webb, prevented the enemy from establishing firing positions within effective range of the ridge. Matsuda's forces found themselves in a tactical nightmare their training had not prepared them for. The Americans were not behaving according to patterns that Japanese intelligence had identified in earlier engagements. Instead of falling back under pressure or breaking during determined assaults, the Marines were fighting with professional competence that turned every Japanese advantage into a liability. The sustained rate of fire that American weapons could maintain proved decisive as the battle entered its second hour. Japanese infantry, armed primarily with bolt-action rifles, found themselves outgunned by Marines who possessed not only superior firepower, but also the tactical training to employ that firepower effectively. Browning machine guns, supported by mortar and artillery, created an interlocking network of destruction that individual courage could not overcome. By midnight, Matsuda's assault had completely lost momentum. His forces scattered and disorganized across the jungle, approaches to the ridge. The general faced a critical choice that would define the rest of the engagement: continue feeding remaining soldiers into what had become a killing field, or acknowledge that his initial strategy had failed. An eerie silence settled over the ridge as the fourth assault wave dissolved into scattered groups of survivors crawling back through undergrowth. Matsuda had committed over 1,600 men to the attacks, and the ridge remained firmly in American hands. But the general was far from finished. In the pre-dawn darkness of August 21st, He prepared a final coordinated assault that would either break the Marine defense or destroy what remained of his command. Patterson moved through his positions, assessing ammunition and redistributing forces to cover gaps that 4 hours of continuous combat had opened in the defensive line. The Marines had performed magnificently, but they were showing the strain of sustained action. Lance Corporal Mitchell had fired over 120 rounds from his rifle, consuming ammunition that normally lasted Marines an entire month of training. His shoulder ached from the rifle's recoil, and his hands trembled slightly as he reloaded 8-round clips by feel in darkness. The colonel's greatest concern was machine gun ammunition. Webb's crew had fired nearly 3,500 rounds, changing barrels twice despite the water-cooled design preventing overheating. The sergeant reported perhaps 600 rounds remaining, enough for sustained engagement but insufficient for a prolonged battle. Matsuda had learned from his earlier failures. His final assault reflected more sophisticated understanding of American defensive capabilities. Instead of mass frontal attacks that played to Marine strengths, he divided remaining forces into smaller infiltration groups tasked with penetrating the American perimeter and attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. The Japanese would sacrifice the psychological impact of banzai charges for tactics that might actually succeed against disciplined defenders. This new approach became apparent when Marine listening posts began reporting movement from previously quiet sectors. Small enemy groups were attempting to work around the flanks, using ravines and dense vegetation to mask approach. These infiltrators carried light weapons and grenades, planning to get close enough to eliminate key weapons like machine guns through surprise attacks. Patterson responded by deploying his reserve forces to counter the infiltration attempts. These were his most experienced Marines, men who had proven their ability to fight effectively in small groups without direct supervision. They moved through the jungle with silent efficiency, using terrain knowledge to intercept Japanese forces before they reached the ridge. The fighting that followed was fundamentally different from earlier assaults. Individual Marines found themselves engaged in close-quarters combat with Japanese soldiers who had penetrated to within 30 yards of key positions. Mitchell heard movement in undergrowth to his left and turned to see a Japanese infiltrator rising with a grenade in hand. The young Marine's rifle cracked once, and the enemy soldier collapsed, the grenade rolling harmlessly down misslope. Webb's position came under direct attack when a Japanese squad managed to approach within grenade range of the machine gun. The sergeant and his crew fought with pistols and rifle stocks as enemy soldiers attempted to overwhelm their sandbag emplacement. One Japanese soldier actually reached the machine gun before Webb killed him with a burst from his Thompson submachine gun, the dead man's body falling across the weapon's tripod. The intensity of close combat created chaos along the perimeter, but it also revealed the fundamental weakness in Matsuda's strategy. By dispersing forces into small infiltration groups, the general had sacrificed the mass and momentum essential for breakthrough operations. Instead of concentrating remaining strength against a single point, he had spread forces across multiple objectives, allowing Marines to defeat each group separately. American artillery continued its devastating role, now firing at targets identified by forward observers, sometimes only yards from enemy positions. The proximity of combatants made fire missions extremely dangerous, requiring split-second timing and precise navigation to avoid friendly casualties. Shell bursts illuminated the jungle in brief, nightmarish glimpses, revealing Japanese soldiers desperately seeking cover among twisted roots and fallen logs. The tactical situation had evolved into exactly the kind of fighting that favored American training and equipment. Marines excelled at small unit actions requiring individual initiative and adaptation. Their weapons were designed for sustained fire and close-range accuracy. Their doctrine emphasized aggressive counterattacks that prevented enemy forces from consolidating gains or establishing firing positions. As dawn approached, the character of the battle shifted once more. Matsuda's infiltration tactics had failed to achieve breakthrough, and daylight would expose his remaining forces to devastating fire from American positions that commanded excellent observation zones. The general faced the prospect of continuing attacks in broad daylight against defenders who had already proven their ability to inflict catastrophic casualties. The Japanese began withdrawing shortly after 5 a.m. Mortar fire provided cover, though the bombardment was poorly coordinated and largely ineffective. Marine observers watched through field glasses as scattered groups of enemy soldiers retreated through the jungle, abandoning equipment and wounded in their haste to escape the killing ground around the ridge. Patterson ordered his forces to maintain their positions and avoid pursuit operations that might expose them to ambush or prepared enemy defense. The colonel understood his mission was defensive, and he had achieved that mission with tactical victory exceeding all reasonable expectations. His 800 Marines had not only held their ground against overwhelming odds, but had effectively destroyed an enemy force 3 times their size. The devastation became apparent as reconnaissance patrols moved through the battlefield. Marines counted over 750 enemy bodies on the ridge's approaches, with many more wounded evacuated during retreat. American casualties numbered fewer than 60 killed and wounded, a casualty ratio that would have seemed impossible to military analysts examining preliminary force dispositions. Matsuda's failure at the ridge effectively ended Japanese offensive capabilities in this sector and marked the beginning of a strategic shift, characterizing the remainder of the Pacific War. The Marines had demonstrated that disciplined defenders with superior firepower could defeat numerically superior attackers regardless of their reputation for fanatical courage. They had shown that American forces could adapt tactics to exploit enemy weaknesses while maximizing their own technological and training advantages. As dawn painted the jungle canopy in shades of gold and green, Patterson surveyed the battlefield stretching below the ridge. Bodies lay scattered across approaches in groupings that told the story of each failed assault. The silence that had settled over the ridge carried an almost supernatural quality, broken only by distant calls of tropical birds resuming their morning routines. For American military planners, the successful defense validated training programs and tactical doctrines developed during peacetime but never tested under real combat conditions. The emphasis on small unit leadership, individual marksmanship, and coordinated use of supporting weapons had proven devastatingly effective against an enemy renowned for military competence. Japanese military leadership faced the difficult task of explaining how elite infantry units had been destroyed by a numerically inferior enemy fighting from prepared positions. Traditional Japanese military thinking had emphasized spiritual strength and aggressive tactics as keys to victory, concepts that had proven inadequate against American firepower and defensive expertise. The ridge that would bear Patterson's name had become the graveyard of Japanese hopes for this sector of the Solomon Islands. The 800 Marines who held it had proven that superior numbers meant nothing against superior preparation, training, and leadership. They had rewritten the rules of defensive warfare and set the standard that American forces would follow for the remainder of the Pacific War.